It was just past midnight when I started to feel the weight of the night catch up with me. The truck's engine hummed steadily beneath me, the only sound other than the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. I was hauling a load of supplies across New Mexico, driving along a desolate stretch of highway that had always been eerily quiet, even at the best of times. The road seemed endless, just long, straight lines of blacktop stretching toward the horizon, no sign of life for miles around. The weather was cold that night. A brisk wind whipped across the open desert, and a few stray clouds dotted the sky, blocking out the moon. The temperature had dropped considerably since I had started my shift, and the air was sharp against the skin, making it feel even lonelier out there on that empty highway. The visibility was low. A fine mist from the desert had begun to settle over the road, making everything feel distant and distant, like the world itself was far out of reach. I had been driving for what felt like hours, barely able to keep my eyes open as the fatigue from the road pressed down on me. With every mile I drove, I felt more detached from everything: the city, the world, even myself. It was the perfect recipe for a long, sleepless night. Just then, a figure appeared in the distance, standing by the side of the road. I slowed down, thinking it might be a hitchhiker or someone stranded in need of help. It wasn't entirely unusual to see someone on the roadside in this area. It was a place where travelers would sometimes stop for rest. But something about this man, standing alone in the middle of nowhere at that hour, made me hesitate. I'm not one to ignore people in need, especially out here. So, I pulled my truck over, the tires crunching slightly on the gravel as I rolled to a stop. The man's figure came into sharper focus as I got closer. He was tall, dressed in a worn leather jacket and jeans, with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He had that rugged, road-weary look, like someone who had been on the move for a while. I cracked my window, giving him a nod. "Hey there, you need help?" I called out. He walked slowly toward the truck, his steps heavy against the gravel. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice rough, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. "My car broke down just down the road a bit. Could you spare a bottle of water? I've been walking for hours and I'm parched." His request was simple enough. Normally, I wouldn't think twice. I've helped a lot of people in similar situations, and it's part of the code we truckers follow. We help each other out when we can. So, I reached over to the passenger seat to grab the water bottle I always kept on hand. But as I was handing it to him, I noticed something odd. His eyes. They were locked onto mine with an intensity that made me pause. It wasn't the gratefulness I expected. It was something colder. He hadn't moved an inch since he approached, still standing just outside the door, like he was waiting for something. A shiver ran up my spine, but I ignored it. Maybe it was just the late hour getting to me. I handed the bottle of water through the window. "Here you go, man," I said, trying to shake off the creeping unease in my gut. But the man didn't take the water. Instead, he took a step forward, getting too close to the door. His body was positioned at a strange angle now, blocking my view of the road. My instincts kicked in. Something wasn't right. Before I could react, I heard movement from behind the truck. I whipped my head around and saw two more men emerging from the shadows of the roadside bushes. They moved quickly, too quickly, as if they had been waiting for this exact moment. One of them had a crowbar, and the other was holding something that looked like a heavy pipe. Their faces were hidden behind dark masks, but the intent in their eyes was clear. They weren't here to ask for help. They were here to attack. My heart raced as I realized what was happening. I was being set up. This wasn't a random encounter. This was an ambush. Without thinking, I slammed the door shut, locking it as quickly as I could. The man at my window reached for the handle, but I had already floored the gas pedal, sending the truck roaring down the road. I didn't look back, I heard the sound of the men shouting, but I didn't care. I didn't know if they had a car waiting or if they planned to chase me on foot, but I didn't want to find out. My eyes were glued to the rearview mirror as I sped down the highway, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly, my knuckles were white. The road ahead was empty, the headlights cutting through the mist and the darkness. But I didn't dare slow down. Every few seconds, I checked my mirrors, half expecting to see their car or hear the sound of engines. But nothing followed. I didn't stop until I reached a truck stop about 20 miles down the road. When I pulled in, I felt the tension in my shoulders release, though I could still feel the rush of adrenaline in my blood. My hands were shaking as I parked, and I sat there for a few minutes before finally getting out of the truck. Inside the truck stop, I told the clerk what had happened. He didn't seem shocked. In fact, he told me that the area had been a hotspot for these kinds of ambushes for months. A group of men had been targeting truck drivers, pulling them over with fake car trouble, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The police had been notified, but these guys were elusive. They knew the back roads too well and had been getting away with it for a while. The whole thing made me sick. I had nearly fallen into their trap. If I hadn't reacted quickly enough, things could have turned out much differently. As I sat there, sipping a coffee to calm my nerves, I thought about how quickly everything could have gone wrong. The road that had seemed so endless and lonely just hours before now felt dangerous. I had made it out, but who knows how many others hadn't been so lucky. The desert highway may be empty, but it's far from peaceful. The next time I drive through that stretch of road, I'll be much more cautious, and I'll trust my instincts even more. My best friend Cassidy and I had been planning a weekend getaway for months. We both needed a break from the hectic city life and thought it would be the perfect opportunity to escape to a secluded cabin in the woods. The cabin was tucked away in a remote part of Queensland, far from the noise and chaos of the city. It was the kind of place where the silence was almost deafening, surrounded by towering trees and dense foliage. We arrived at the cabin just before sunset. It had a rustic, cozy charm to it, exactly what we were looking for. The first few hours went by peacefully as we settled in, cooked dinner, and enjoyed the quiet atmosphere. It was a perfect night so far, with no one around for miles and nothing but nature surrounding us. But as the evening wore on and the night crept in, the silence seemed to grow heavier. We played some music and talked, the dim light from the fireplace flickering in the corner. It was around midnight when the first knock came. We were sitting in the living room when we both heard it, a loud knock on the front door, followed by another. It was sudden, and it made both of us jump. My heart raced as I exchanged a nervous glance with Cassidy. "Did you hear that?" Cassidy asked, her voice shaky. I nodded, feeling my throat tighten. We weren't expecting anyone. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, and there were no neighbors for miles. It didn't make sense. "Maybe it's just someone lost," I suggested, trying to calm us both down. But I could already feel the unease creeping in. Cassidy stood up and walked cautiously to the door, peering through the peephole. There was nothing. The porch was empty. Nothing but the faint glow of moonlight shining through the trees. I thought maybe it was an animal, or just the wind playing tricks on us. But when Cassidy opened the blinds, we both froze. There was no one out there. "I don't like this," Cassidy whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "It's too quiet." Just as she spoke, another knock echoed through the cabin, louder this time, more insistent. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Whoever was out there wasn't leaving. Something didn't feel right. We backed away from the door. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining what had happened. The operator told me to stay inside, lock the doors, and not to open it under any circumstances. They assured me that they would send someone immediately. Minutes dragged by, but it felt like hours. The knocks stopped, and for a brief moment, we thought it was over. But then from the back of the cabin, I heard something else. A rustling noise, like someone was moving behind the building. I felt the blood drain from my face. There's someone else. Behind the cabin. I whispered to Cassidy, my voice trembling. Cassidy rushed to the window and peeked out, her face paling as she saw a figure, barely visible in the shadows, moving around the back. I felt panic rising in my chest. Whoever it was, they weren't just standing around. They were circling the cabin. I didn't know what to do. The police weren't here yet, and we were completely isolated. The minutes felt like eternity. But then, finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it wasn't over yet. When the officers arrived, we quickly explained the situation, and they immediately began to search the property. It didn't take long before they found something. A man, hiding behind the trees, just outside the cabin, trying to stay out of sight. The police apprehended him immediately. The man was disheveled, wearing dark clothes, and had clearly been lurking in the shadows for a while. As it turned out, the man was a wanted criminal. He had been linked to multiple cases of violent attacks on women in nearby areas. The officers later told us that he had been hiding in the woods, waiting for the right moment to strike. My heart sank. This wasn't just some random stranger. It was the same man who had been terrorizing women in the region. The police confirmed that his crime spree had been escalating, and he had been using isolated spots like ours to lay low and plan his next move. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. We had been incredibly lucky. If we had opened the door or not called the police right away, we could have been the next victims. The officers stayed with us until they were sure the area was secure. We didn't sleep much that night. How could we? Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind felt like someone was still out there, waiting. But at least we were safe. We never went back to that cabin. That night stayed with us, a chilling reminder of how close we had come to becoming victims of a criminal who had been hiding in plain sight. My best friend Jasper and I have always been photography enthusiasts. We love venturing out into remote areas to capture the beauty of nature, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. That day, we decided to head to a secluded spot deep in the mountains, an area known for its dense forests and scenic views. The plan was simple: take some breathtaking photos and enjoy the peace of being far away from civilization. We drove for hours, the road getting narrower as we went further into the wilderness. Finally, we found the perfect spot, a small clearing surrounded by towering trees and a winding stream. We got out of the car, grabbed our gear, and started taking pictures, enjoying the serenity of being alone in the middle of nowhere. The air was fresh, and the only sounds we could hear were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird chirping. After a while, we were so absorbed in our work that we didn't notice the man approaching until he was only a few feet away. He was walking toward us slowly, looking a little disheveled, his clothes dirty, as though he'd been out in the elements for a while. He had a tired look on his face, but when he got closer, he smiled and raised his hand in greeting. "Hey there," he said. "Sorry to bother you, but I'm in a bit of a jam." Jasper and I exchanged glances, but we didn't say anything. The man continued. "My car broke down just down the road. Could you guys help me out? I really need a phone or a lift into town. I don't have a signal out here." It didn't seem too unusual at first. People get stuck on roads all the time. But something in the man's tone didn't sit right with me. His body language was off, too stiff, too forced. And the fact that he didn't seem at all worried about being out in the middle of nowhere raised a red flag. Jasper, always the more trusting one, started to walk toward him. But I held back. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My instincts were screaming at me to be cautious. "Where exactly did your car break down?" I asked, my voice flat, trying to keep the conversation calm. The man hesitated for a moment, looking down as though he was searching for the right words. "It's about half a mile back, near the bend in the road, just past the old bridge. You'll see it." I was about to respond when I felt a wave of unease wash over me. There was no bridge nearby. No real reason for him to be that far out in the woods without anyone else around. That's when I knew something was off. I discreetly pulled out my phone and texted Jasper, telling him to call the police quietly. I didn't want the man to know we were onto him, but I also didn't want to take any chances. Jasper read the message and nodded, though he didn't say anything. He kept talking to the man, who had started pacing, his eyes scanning the area like he was trying to figure out what our next move would be. "You know, I'm really sorry about this," the man said suddenly, his tone shifting. "I wouldn't bother you, but I've been out here for hours." That was when I noticed it. His eyes. They weren't looking at us. They were darting around, almost like he was trying to gauge the distance between us and his supposed car. Something wasn't adding up. His story didn't match the geography of the area, and I could sense the tension building between us. I could see the change in Jasper's expression, too. He was starting to feel the same sense of danger I did. We had to act fast. "Look, I'm sure someone will come by and help you," I said, trying to sound calm but firm. "Maybe you should wait for a tow truck or something." The man froze, his face hardening. I could tell he realized that we weren't as gullible as he had hoped. His body stiffened, and I saw him glance over his shoulder, like he was considering making a run for it. Then, almost in an instant, he turned around and began to walk briskly back into the woods. I couldn't help but notice how quickly he moved, as though he knew he'd been caught and was eager to flee before we could do anything. Jasper and I stood there for a moment, frozen. As the man disappeared into the trees, I felt a mix of relief and adrenaline flood through me. I waited for what felt like an eternity, watching the spot where he had vanished, before I finally let out the breath I didn't even realize I was holding. Just as the man disappeared completely, I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. Thankfully, the police were on their way. They arrived within minutes, and we quickly explained what had happened. The officers searched the area thoroughly, but found no trace of the man. Later that day, the police called me back. It turned out that the man we had encountered was a wanted criminal. He had been involved in multiple incidents of robbery and had been on the run for weeks. They believed he had been using the remote areas to lay low and target unsuspecting people like us. The police were grateful that we hadn't fallen for his trap and had acted quickly. When I looked back on the incident, I realized how lucky we were to have gotten out of there without anything happening. Had we let our guard down, who knows what could have happened? That man wasn't just asking for help. He was looking for an opportunity to strike. We didn't go back to that area for a long time. The whole experience left me shaken, and I couldn't help but wonder how many others had fallen victim to people like him, preying on the vulnerable in the most isolated places.